If you played Cyberpunk 2077, you've probably seen these really cool loading screen, splash screen type compositions. They're basically still images with a little bit of animation. And ever since I played Cyberpunk 2077, I really wanted to remake something like this for a project. And recently I got the opportunity to actually do it. We had a really cool CG scene in a sort of dystopian world set up for a customer, but it needed some padding at the start and end. And since it was set in a sort of video gamey world and I'd been so inspired by Cyberpunk, I built a sort of video game cutscene loading screen situation around it. And the process was really interesting, especially for the splash screen at the end, because it both had a lot of AI generation stuff involved, but also a lot of manual labor. So today I want to do a breakdown of that process. We'll make a completely new scene and composition, and we'll take it from start to finish, from weird AI generation nonsense to a lot of finicky manual detail work. For this composition, I'm imagining sort of desert that has some sort of device or satellite crash landed in it that's been found by Militech or Arasaka or whatever. So we need to create a desert, we need to create some form of device, we need to create some form of vehicle, and tie all of that together in one composition. So we're going to kick off with the generation of the desert landscape I'm imagining. And we at Bigger Feet have two options for this. We've got an Adobe Creative Cloud account, which includes Firefly, so we can use that for image generation. We also have Luma AI account, so we'll also be playing around with that to see if that gives us any different results. So first up, the prompt: desert landscape at night with dystopian neon city far off in the background, starry night and clear sky. Photorealistic render look. We're also taking the exact same prompt into Luma AI. All right, so this is something I've bumped into with Firefly before, that the results are both very photo-like and the details are sort of strange. I also strongly dislike the sort of harsh lighting and strong saturation thing that it does. It always comes out looking sort of like it was shot on a camcorder in 2002. So over at Luma, I would argue that the result, like the composition, is less of what I'm looking for, and the neon city, it took a bit too literally. I don't really need that sort of teal and purple lighting in the background. I think it's cool, it's very cyberpunky, but it's not really what I'm after. So we're going to refine a bit. So something like make the city lighting more natural, fewer purples and pinks, more oranges and yellows, and let's see what that comes up with. That's getting really cool, but I think the composition is still quite a ways off. I'm also trying to refine a little bit in Firefly, but the results keep having that camcordery vibe that I'm not really into. Ooh, okay, now I think we're really getting somewhere with the composition. We've got the city on the left as a sort of highlight, we've got the mountains on the right as a sort of frame for where the car can sit, and then this big open surface in the sort of front and center that can have the crashed device that we're going for. I do want to refine the lighting a bit more though. Yes, I think this is just about there. It's not quite as midnighty as what I was going for. It's surprisingly difficult to get it to do the time of day in the way you're imagining it. So let's take this landscape forward into the rest of the project. And let's move on to a vehicle that can show up to discover this crashed device. Firefly, it's gotten close, but vehicles are always sort of lumpy in a way that I find hard to put my finger on. Let's see what Luma AI can do. Okay, the first attempt is really interesting. These are cool black sort of neo-futuristic trucks, but it's leaned very hard into the sort of custom lowered lowrider truck thing, which is not what I'm after. I want more tech. And yep, that's basically it. Some of these are a little Ford Raptor-y for my liking, but I really like the one with the sort of hook-shaped headlights. So let's try and see if it can change the lighting to match the desert scene a bit better and move on with that car. And then the last separate asset that we need to generate is some sort of crashed device. Now I want to go a little retro futuristic 80s here again, so it could be a device that Militech sent into space in the 1980s and that came crashing down to Earth 100 years later. That's me fantasizing about the world building. But what we're looking at here is starting to look pretty decent, I think. I really like the device that has this sort of antenna, feels a little bit satellite-y. And just to have it done, I also tried Firefly. Don't love the results here. They are a little bit sort of detailless. Again, there's nothing distinguishable about what these crashed things are. They're just sort of, which I guess could work. It doesn't really matter what the device actually is, but I'd like for it to be at least vaguely identifiable. All right, I'm running into something kind of difficult with Luma because I wanted to show this device from slightly further away and slightly higher up, but it can't seem to process that as a sort of term. It doesn't really know what to do with the camera and the framing. So it's just giving me iterations of the same frame over and over again, which is not what I'm after. But I'll try to take what we have now into Photoshop to bring the composition together, and if it doesn't work, maybe I'll try something else. So we've imported the landscape. I upscaled it a little bit because it came out of Luma in 1080p. The other assets I don't really need to scale up because they're going to stay fairly small in the composition. So the car goes off into the corner. Need to remove the background, obviously. Yeah, thereabouts sort of works. So I'll refine this in a little bit. And then for this weird non-device, it's a little bit tricky to figure out what I want to keep of the surrounding stuff because there's so much debris and weird shadows around that I don't really need. I quite like this, but first of all, I'm not really sure what to do sort of animation wise with it, and it does need to do something for visual interest in the eventual video we're making. I'm also not quite sure how to make Photoshop blend in all of this detail properly, so I think we're going to try something different. Okay, that took a little bit more iteration than I hoped it would, because again, Luma doesn't seem to be taking prompts about framing very well, and also the lighting was difficult to match, but I have settled on something. I think these TV-like devices that aren't real TVs, but sort of weird prototypey looking things that is sort of half buried in the desert. I think that will look really cool. So we're gonna take that and try and blend it into our desert scene. Yeah, I think that works pretty well. Obviously it needs blending, which we'll get to next. And I think the truck needs to be slightly off screen. Otherwise its headlights will basically blow past this object, and that won't make much sense. Also, the sort of soft lighting and the lack of contrast that's happening in the desert, we'll need to reflect that in the vehicle and in the crash device. So to do that, I'm taking the Photoshop raw filter and decreasing the dehaze and clarity sliders quite a lot, as well as changing the color balance and temperature and stuff a bit. Okay, now to actually blend these two objects in the scene, and for this we're going to use Photoshop's AI fill thing, which is really cool and really powerful in odd and specific circumstances. It's sort of finicky though. So for example, in the TV-like device, it worked really well to blend it into the desert sand and make it look like it's buried properly, but it also mangled some of the details on the side of the device. And if we were framing it differently and looking at the device up close, I would not have liked this, but for now I think we're just going to leave it because the frame is what it is and it's going to remain static. For making the car feel like it's sitting in the sand, that actually worked really well, but what isn't working well is creating tire tracks and shadows and additional detail. It doesn't really seem to grasp what I want it to do, even with different prompts. The tire tracks I'm also going to leave for what they are now, but I do think the car needs a shadow to sell the fact that it's actually there, so I'm going to make one manually. This is a little bit of a faffy process. It's requiring a lot of painting and masking and painting and blurring edges softly. But I think it's coming together quite all right. I also think I want to swap out the sky for something that's a bit more dramatic, because this sunset is kind of lovely, but doesn't really have that grungy, dark vibe that I was going for. So we're using Photoshop's built-in sky replacement, which is super handy, really quick and really effective to map in a stock photo of a really dramatic cloudy sky. And it just matches the lighting so well that I'm basically not going to do much more about it. I like the way this looks now. And like we've had the shadow underneath the car, we also need to change the lighting angles basically on the TV-like device, because there will be headlights coming from the car beaming onto the device from behind. And basically there won't be very much environmental lighting. So it doesn't make sense that there's lighting hitting the front panel of the TV now, but not the sides. Just like the shadow under the car, this is a process that involves a lot of drawing shadows by hand and masking them out and making edges go soft, but some edges go hard where they meet the device. I need to mask out the front panel, but not the monitor, because I have a cool idea for what I want the monitor to display, and I want it to be turned on, so the monitor itself needs to emit some light later. But the front panel does need to be dark, so we're masking out the front panel and adding basically a black overlay that we blend mode in with something like soft light or overlay like that. And we're doing something similar with the panel on the side, except we're not putting on a black surface and blend moding it. We are taking the exposure effect and adding a mask specifically around only the side of the panel, so we can play with the exposure values and the gamma of just that tiny portion of the image. And I think that's starting to look fairly convincing. As it is right now, the monitor itself is looking a bit weirdly bright, but that will make more sense when we actually display something on it in After Effects later. For now, one of the last touches that I want to do is adding light streaks that fall onto the ground from the car. We'll be adding light beams also in After Effects, but I think the light on the ground we can do in advance in Photoshop right now. So we're going to draw out the rough shape in just a white solid basically, and masking it out with a lot of gradients so that there's sort of a light fall off from strong to weaker further away from the car. I am reasonably pleased with this result, but you shouldn't look too hard at the perspective and the angles that the light is falling at, because I don't think the way that the car is actually oriented would beam lights this close to where we are looking from. But first of all, I don't really mind that as part of the aesthetic. It looks a bit both handmade and AI generated anyway, so leaning into that a little bit doesn't matter so much to me. So it's a little wonky, but we're leaning into it. Now, to cross the T's and dot the I's on this composition, I want to use some of Photoshop's neural filters. The first one should help us get the lighting and coloring where I want it to be. Yeah, okay, no, that did not work at all. The landscape mixer tool, for some reason, reimagines the whole composition and regenerates it as an AI thing, but it doesn't keep the details correctly, so it's really screwed up now. So instead of this, we'll just do the lighting and the vibe and the colors and whatever in Lumetri all the way at the end of the process. What does work really quite well is the depth blur filter. It generates a fake depth map and it allows you to do a little bit of depth blur. Now we shouldn't go overboard because this is quite a wide frame and it's weird if the background is completely out of focus. But I do like to draw a bit more attention on the stuff that's in the foreground. So we're gonna do that. And we're adding a little bit of foggy haze to make the scene feel a little bit more mysterious. And that's it. We've got our final image ready to take into After Effects. All right, in After Effects, we make a composition in a format that makes sense. So for me, that is 4K at 23.976 frames per second. And the first thing I'm doing is some prep work because I'll want to add some fog, but because we're dealing with fake depth, as in there are no volumetrics, it's just flat layers. What I think I'll want to do is add 3, 4, 5 different fog overlays in a way that all stack. But for the layers that are in the background, they'll need to be hidden behind the car and some of the ground in the foreground in a way. And same with the layers that are slightly closer to the front. When it's actually foggy outside, the first couple of meters, usually you don't see any fog. The fog sort of sets in slightly further into the frame. So we're going to make some masks that will help us make that happen. And the way I'm making these masks is firstly by drawing a rough outline of the shapes that they definitely need to avoid. And then also add a white solid with a gradient to full transparency that sort of intersects with the shape I've just drawn. And then we'll pre-comp this into one shape so that it functions as a mask, and the fog will only show up in the transparent areas, but we'll get to that later. All right, next is a part I've been really looking forward to because we want to show something on the TV screen. I think it'll be really cool to make some more reference to Cyberpunk 2077. So the person we're going to display on this TV is Gillian Jordan, one of Night City's favorite news reporters. All right, I think this TV screen is probably a 3:2 aspect ratio. It's AI generated, so who actually knows? But I think that feels about right. So we're making my composition that aspect ratio and taking Gillian Jordan's clip into that composition. Then I'm adding a solid and making a grid on that solid. And I'm using Gillian Jordan's clip in the background as a Luma mask for these sort of CRT lines, if you will. Of course, it needs to be a monochrome green because, you know, it'll look sort of alien and techie and prototypey or whatever. Not to mention that green will make for a really cool sort of light beam color to beam off the TV into the fog. So that looks really cool. And now I'm corner pinning it to the TV screen. I'm also coming to realize that I probably shouldn't have made the screen in the Photoshop image this bright. I should have made it darker instead and just have the cracks in the screen stand out as sort of light features. Because the screen blending mode that I'm using to project Jillian's face onto this TV works much better if the background is dark. That's where it retains more detail. And in the light sections, it lets through what's on top of the screen, in this case, the cracks. So I'll do something about that down the line. I'll take down the exposure of just the screen a bit so that the detail of Jillian's face comes through better. But now for the bit that I think will actually bring this to life really nicely, and that is that I discovered that radial blur is really good for faking light beams. So I'm duplicating Jillian's pre-composition and I'm adding the radial blur effect to it in the zoom setting. And then I'm placing the center somewhere behind the screen so that there's light beams sort of popping out the front. Now, as it is, it feels kind of flimsy, so I'm adding the levels effect and set it to alpha. And I'm basically making the transparency fall off of these light beams really sharp so that you can see more of the full length of these light beams. And of course we need it to really shine, so a blend mode like classic color dodge or just regular color dodge works really well to just make it pop as a light source. And then we're doing basically exactly what we just did with the lights of the car. First I've drawn some fake shapes to sort of match the light sources on the headlights. I've pre-combed the left headlight and the right headlights separately so that they function as individual sources, because it doesn't make much sense if the light beams for these two separate headlines originate from one single point somewhere centrally in the car. They would just sort of go off in two separate directions, which is not what we're after. All right, it took a little bit of fiddling to get the relative transparencies right because I'm using various blend modes. The light beam closest was overlaying the rear light beam and making it brighter than made sense. So the transparency of the light beam on the left, the right side of the car technically, but the left from our point of view, is at 50% transparency, and the one on the right is at 90% transparency, because that one needs to be stronger to sort of convey the same feeling. Oh, I also forgot to mention that I added the wiggle effect to both the TV screen's overlay, so to Jillian's face, and to the headlights, so the TV screen now flickers 24 times per second, or has slightly different brightness, at least 24 times per second, and the headlines sort of glow and beam a bit, they pulse a little bit. But the headlights are a lot slower, they change intensity every sort of half second. And I think that will help convey the idea that fog banks are passing by the headlights and sort of changing the relative brightness at any given point. And speaking of fog, let's go make some fog. I'm doing this with a white solid with the turbulent noise effect on it. I'm gonna do a couple different things. So like I said, I'm gonna layer this a bit. The fog layer that's most in the foreground is gonna have the least detail. It's gonna be sort of blown up, and it's going to move the fastest because it's closest. You'll see more of it passing by. So its evolution is going to be fairly quick. I'm doing this with a command, which is just time times a certain amount, so that the evolution dial keeps spinning continuously forever and forever. And then I'm also keyframing the position of the actual noise so that it's sort of passing from left to right. And I'll duplicate this 4 times. The further back I'll have this go, the more detail I'll have, but the slower I'll make it move. I'm struggling a little bit with the blend modes here. I'm having a hard time finding a good balance between making it softer and foggy, but not making it either dark or super blown out. I think the blend mode that I actually want to be using is soft light because it interacts more with the brighter sections than with the darker sections, which means that stuff like the TV's light beam and the headlight beams from the car, they will be sort of highlighted, but the rest of the frame, which is slightly darker, will stay a little bit more subdued in the fog. I think that will be quite cool. Soft light needs a middle gray to not respond to, and then a slightly brighter area that looks like the foggy clouds that are passing by, or the fog banks. So what I'm doing is adding the levels effect to all of these fog layers and setting the output black in the middle instead of at hard black, so that all of the blacks become middle grays, and all of the data into the whites is sort of compressed into that space. I also forgot to mention that, of course, I used the masks that we made at the start of the After Effects bit to mask out the different fog layers at different depths. So the two fog layers that are supposed to be the closest are using the mask that is around the TV and just use a little bit of gradient into the foreground. And the ones that are further in the background are masked out by the car and a gradient that goes further into the depth. And then for the final touches that really actually tie all of this together, the color, first of all, we are going to do with Lumetri. So I've added an adjustment layer and the Lumetri effect, and I'm going for something, I want to say bleach bypassy, but it's not quite bleach bypass, it's just sort of dark and contrasty and dramatic with a slight lift in the blacks. I think I'm also going to do the glow effect to really hammer home the light sources in this. It does something slightly weird to the clouds, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I like what it's doing to the lights more than I dislike what it's doing to the clouds, so I'm going to leave it the way it is. The second to last thing I'll do is add some chromatic aberration in the corner of the frames. And there's a free effect that I'm using here called Quick Chromatic Aberration 3. It is fabulous. I'll link it down below. If you're into After Effects and making things look a little vintagey, distorted-y, lovely, download it. It's free, it's good, do it. And then the very last thing I'm doing is adding some grain. And I'm saying some, but I'm making this quite strong. And there we have it. Just hit export and watch your dramatic cyberpunk-y scene come to life. Now, one thing I would do if I had a little bit more time in this specific scene is to animate the clouds a bit so that there's some movement in the sky. I think it's really cool as it is now, but the amount of movement could be a little bit more interesting. With the example that I showed you at the start of this video, the one that I actually made for a client, this is sort of compensated for by all the gooey elements on the screen, so you don't really need as much movement in the actual image because the additional visual interest is coming from the text and the branding and the little loading bar, whatever stuff that's animating right in front of you. So that is what keeps your attention. But if you're just using this on its own, it needs a little more spice, I think, or add GUI elements. But I'm very curious to hear what you think. First of all, do you like Cyberpunk as much as I do? Because I fucking love it, and it's inspired me to do some cool work. And beyond that, first of all, let me know if there's any questions about this. I'd love to answer all of them in the comments. And let me know if you use any of these techniques and effects and want to share it with the community, because also we'd love to see your work. But for now, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to push all the positive buttons down below, and we'll see you in the next one. Ciao!